I've created a fairly handy little meta node for controlling camera's focal. I created it out of a need for a quick and easy solution uh, just to kind of match some of the typical focal lengths I kind of end up using depending on the camera's pitch. So what this tool does is when the camera is pitched up, it will reduce the focal length. And if I select the camera and you take a look at the focal, which I do have set to the millimeter, if you go to the options, file and options, you do have the ability to show the camera's field of view in the object properties. This is designed for focal length rather than field of view, although it would still work because the numbers used to control don't change for the field of view, just your display for the focal. And now when the camera pitches down, the focal length increases, so zooming in to the terrain. And really the way I was thinking of it was if I was going to be photographing or filming a terrain from the air, I would typically be zooming into areas of interest. So therefore, I automatically have it set to increase my focal length as I pitch the camera down. And because typically when you're looking up, you would want to see more of a field of view once the sky is involved. And when you reach the ground, I'll go ahead and just move the camera to the ground and pitch it up, you would really want to be able to see as much of the landscape as possible. Now granted, use this as more of just a quick reference and not necessarily always going to be the final result, but it has sped up some of the camera work that I have to do within the program, and I thought I'd share with you the node and how to design it, because it's actually really simple and a fairly straightforward control. So let's take a look at the graph where you can see I already have the autofocal set up. And if you take a look, I have published from the meta node the primary controls, which is the minimum degree amount, so the pitch degree. And if we take a look in the numerics tab and under pitch, it'll give you a good idea, the reference. As you pitch the camera up, we can see that the pitch reduces, and as we move the camera down, the pitch will increase. So I have a minimum and a maximum value and a focal tied to each amount. So that way I could adjust if I wanted to and increase these values. If I really wanted the camera to zoom in, I could increase the overall focal once the camera is pitched down. So if I wanted this to be, let's say, 80 instead of what I have is 60, once I pitch the camera down, it'll really zoom in, and there'll be quite a large change between the pitch. Same thing with the minimum amount. I could decrease the focal in order to open it up a little bit more. And then I could set the degree amounts as well. Right now I have 45 for the min and 155 for the max, which seems to work pretty well for the most part. So let's take a look at the meta node. As you can see, it's very simplistic. There's really not a whole lot to it. It's just got a couple of nodes in here, and let's go ahead and just build this from scratch. So what we can do is add in the vector 3 input. This gives us the ability to connect outside the node. So once I added that in, you can see within the main graph that we do have a new vector 3 input. So this will allow me to connect to the camera's orientation, which is the top input node. meaning that our control is not locked to anything and we're grabbing from that data rather than controlling it as we would if we were connecting to an output. So the next step is to add in, if we right click, go to Add Math Node, Vector Operation, Decomposer 3. The Decomposer 3 will break down a vector, which is composed of 3 different numbers, the x, y, and z, and break them down into 3 number outputs. So we can individually select which axis we'd like to have our control from. And now what I did next was add in the map filter. And as you can see, every control within the main meta node is just this filter. What it does is it takes an inputted range and tells view basically when, in this case, the pitch is at 45, the output will equal a number of 18. So since we're controlling the focal, what we're going to have is when the pitch is at 45, it equals 18. And then the upper value, when the pitch equals 155, the focal equals 60. And then it'll automatically transition everything in between. The clip out of range value is important for this, because if you pitch the camera up too high, it's going to continue to limit and calculate what we have set up, producing focal lengths that are not defined and can usually end up in far too large of a value and offset the camera too much and cause some issues. So we'll add in filter node, and we can select map and just go ahead and select the top input and connect it to just letting go of the mouse over the highlighted area and selecting the x-axis, which is the pitch. So then we can set up the same way the lower value and upper value. Both lowers would be equal, so we have right now 45 for the degree, and then the focal, whatever we want. So then for the upper value in the input, our degree, which would be the pitch down, I have mine set to 155 for the degree. So then when the camera is equal, the pitch is equal to 155, the output becomes 60 as the focal. Now, these numbers are not going to work directly as an output for the focal length because it does actually need to be divided by 2, which is why the next node I have is just another filter that divides this output by 2. So we can add in a filter node, select the divide, and 2 is the default. So once we connect that, and now all we need to choose is the output. So we're going to add an output node, which is going to be the double output, which is a number, and connect that to the end of the line. So for reference, you can name these so that when you highlight over them within the function editor, right now we see vector3 input, so I'm going to call this orientation, and then we'll see that show up within the node. And you can work back and forth like this between the 2 windows, which is really nice. So then our output is the focal length. So on the bottom, when you mouse over, we see that becomes available as an option. I'm going to go ahead and delete everything that's currently part of this node, and we're going to see it disconnects us from the camera, and we don't have anything published anymore. So what we need to do is bring these settings from the map node available to the main interface. I also want to make sure that you clip the out of range values so that when you go beyond the value or the degree of 45 or 155, you're not decreasing or increasing the focal range beyond the defined minimum and maximum amount. So in order to publish this, and set up groups for it, there's a little publish command which is on the left and only available when you're, of course, editing a meta node. So we can publish, and we're going to call this the lower range, or in the minimum, and I like to do min and max. It's a little bit easier, just because I'm used to IK systems, which in a way is how this works. If you're familiar with an inverse kinematic system and the minimum maximum ranges for setting up bones, this is basically the same thing, except instead of just having a limiter and constraining the range, we are giving ourselves an output within it. So we're going to call this degree, and then it's part of the minimum group. I'm going to click OK, and we're going to see that show up. So I'm going to go down to the bottom and publish the other lower value. Keep that in the minimum group. You do get a pull down for all the groups that are entered, so anytime you enter anything new, it will create a new group automatically. And then we can call this the focal. And then if you want, you could add millimeter in there as reference. And then we just do the same thing with the other value. We publish in a new group, call it max, and then we can type in degree. And then the other upper value, still in the max group, we can call focal, and then do the millimeter again. Click OK. And OK, and now we have our autofocal node. So in order to use this, first you would want to save this out, and then what you can do at any time is load the meta node to select the file, or you can navigate to your content folder for the installation of Vue, and there is a meta nodes folder, and for every group that we see that I'm highlighting over right now, there is a folder for, or the option to have a folder for. Let's say filters. If there's no folder for filter nodes, you can just type in filter, and then a new menu becomes available called meta nodes. So then you'd be able to place that node within that folder and access it directly within the interface, which is really nice. If you need more information about that, take a look at the Snowflake manual from Xylifex. It's has installation information for installing that collection, which is a collection of meta nodes. So all we would need to do is connect the orientation, which is the dependent camera 1 orientation, and then the output focal. Since there's only one option available, it won't give us a menu to choose from or which output, because there's just the one. And then we can auto connect that. Click OK, and the node's set up. So it automatically zooms in, we pitch down, and then increases our field of view when we pitch the camera up, and that can be really helpful. Now, if you want to turn this off and define your own range by going into the camera and typing in a focal amount, and there are a couple of different ways to do this. And you can see that I do have a duplicate set of nodes in here that was just added. That typically won't happen. That's mainly just because of the way I ungrouped that node earlier. So if you ever run into any Opengl refresh problems, sometimes that can happen where the Opengl won't refresh, or let's say that focal won't refresh while we're moving the camera. Now that typically only happens when you have, let's say, the external dependency for the camera directly within the node, and that's usually the only time it limits that. But in case you're having that issue, what you can do is go to the top and ungroup the node, and then it removes it from the meta node and just makes all of those controls directly available without the container. Now, obviously, the easiest way to, or the most straightforward way to stop using this would be to just select the link and hit delete. But if you want to expand on this tool a little bit further, we're going to go to click Edit, and let's set up. I'm going to add in an input node, double input, and we're going to call this focal. And this is going to be kind of a pass-through, where it's going to take the input from outside the node and just kind of run it back through. That way we can define the value. But first what we need to do is split this up so that we can choose from either the dynamic mode or the fixed manual entry. So what we're going to create is a simple on-off switch. And this would only be available for View 8 users. If you're using View 7, you would have to stick to this current configuration, or we'll just take a look and I'll show you how to make this node and expand upon it. What I'm going to do is add a combiner and use the blender and connect the other input in the open one to the focal. So if you're using View 7, you would essentially use this slider, publishing it as an on-off. So moving to 0 to use the dynamic mode, and moving to 1 to have the fixed entered value. You would also need to connect this new input to the focal, which will grab it from the interface when it's entered in to this window. But if you're a View 8 user, we can set up a checkbox, which is going to be a little bit easier. And I'm going to add in a constant node, Boolean number. What this does is outputs a value of -1 by default, and when checked, outputs a number of 1. And added to the Blender node as of View 8 is the clip ratio between 0 and 1. So it'll automatically remove the -1 value and automatically set that to 0. So we're going to turn that on, connect this to the Boolean number, and what we can do is publish this checkbox as an on and off. So what I'm going to do, select the Boolean number, select publish, and I'm not going to put this in a group. You don't need to put anything in a group, and then it'll remain separate from the current groups. And since if we check this on, it's going to go to the manual entry, I'm going to basically make this an off switch for the dynamic. So turn off dynamic, and click OK, and OK again. And now we have that new turn off dynamic switch. And we can connect the focal to the other focal. I also want to note that if you have the function node preview open, you can view the current number being passed through. So if we take a look, we can see right now we have -1, and then if the value is checked, and we might need to refresh, we can see that turns into 1. And that controls this blender, which needs 0 to use this connection and 1 to use this connection. So it's actually pretty straightforward. So now the dynamic is turned off, and our focal will remain whatever the last value was. So since it was 37, when we turned it off, it stays at 37, which is pretty nice that that is remembered. So if we put the dynamic back on, change our camera, and we can see now a value of 42. We can go back into the meta node, turn off the dynamic, and it'll stay at 42. But we can also change it. Let's go ahead and change it to 18. And now we're no longer part of the dynamic mode, and it will stay at this number. So it's a nice little dynamic camera control. Easy to turn on and off. I do want to note that sometimes, depending on the pitch, if you do have the camera selected, occasionally it might kind of jump the camera. For the most part, it seems to be pretty reliable. I wouldn't suggest it for animation, leaving the dynamic mode on, just because of the amount of keyframes it creates. Although that's mainly for auto keyframing. So if you have auto keyframing off, then it works quite well in animation. So that way you have a nice little dynamic change to create and animate certain shots. Now there are two things I just want to note about this. One is a faster way to load that in to a camera that doesn't have the node selected. If we go to the graph, you do have the ability to save out an entire function. So this saves as a function file, and then at any time you can go ahead and load in a graph for anything in the scene, and it'll automatically set up these connections, which is pretty nice. So if you just want a quick and easy way to load that in, you can save those out. Another thing I want to note is that when you use the save camera command, so right now we have camera 1, which currently has the dynamic autofocal turned on, and I click the store camera, which is going to create a duplicate. Now if we move over to the next camera, making it the active camera, you will notice that it doesn't work. The reason for that is because the inputs will be carried over from camera 1. So even though we're now using camera 2, camera 1 is selected and copied over as the dependent. And also some of the other settings will also be camera 1 and carried over. So if you did want to use that on the other camera, you can select those options just using camera 2 orientation, and then it will work correctly. You could also save it as part of your default scene, file, options, and set default scene. So in a clean scene you could load that in. I do suggest that you have a duplicate camera, and then you always leave at least one camera completely free of any sort of graph or function, just in case there's a problem, because it would be more difficult to undo those actions and completely reset the default scene if that happens. So hopefully this little node you find helpful, because I've been using it quite a bit lately, and it's really helped cut down on the amount of time needed to switch back and forth between adjusting the focal, and kind of gives me a better idea of the final shot without actually having to do a whole lot of camera work.